A warm summer evening softly enveloped the streets of the small town of Springwood as Edward James, tired after a long day, walked home. He always tried to come back earlier to spend time with his family, but this time something was wrong. His footsteps echoed off the asphalt, and suddenly the screech of a police car's brakes broke the silence. Blue lights flickered in the night, creating an ominous feeling. A young police officer, with a cold look and a serious expression, approached Edward without immediately explaining the reason for the stop. Edward felt his heart beat faster, even though he hadn't done anything illegal. His thoughts whirled through his head. Why was I stopped? What did I do? This moment, when everything seemed wrong, was the beginning of something bigger, something that could change his life. So what happens next? Why did this evening become so fateful? Find out in the following chapters, and if this story has captured your attention, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in Edward's shoes? Edward James is a man in his 40s, with time-etched features and confidence in his every move. His tall stature and athletic build, despite his age, aroused respect and showed that he was a man who was used to fighting, but not in the physical sense, but for justice. His hair was beginning to turn slightly gray at the temples, but that only added to his wisdom and charisma. However, Edward's appearance didn't attract attention as much as his inner strength and confidence that he exuded in every gesture. Edward was born and raised in this very area of Springwood, where every corner was familiar to him from childhood. He knew his community and always wanted to make it better. Working as a lawyer, he represented the interests of ordinary people, those who could not always afford expensive legal protection. His clients are neighbors, friends, and even strangers who knew his reputation as an honest and fair man. Over the years, he has earned respect both in the professional community and among local residents. Everyone who came across Edward knew that he was always ready to stand up for the rights of those who were wronged or wronged. Despite the seriousness of his profession, Edward remained a very down-to-earth person. He spent his evenings with his wife, Lisa, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah. Lisa was his support and inspiration, and Sarah was his little sun that lit up even the most difficult days. Edward always made time for his family, whether it was taking a walk in the park, reading books before bed, or helping Sarah with her homework. Every morning, Edward would start off with a jog through the neighborhood he'd known since childhood, and then head to his modest law office located in the heart of the city. His day was scheduled by the minute: meetings with clients, participation in meetings, preparation of documents. However, he never complained about being tired. His job gave him a sense of purpose and the satisfaction of helping people cope with life's challenges. Edward was a man who persevered even in the face of injustice. He knew the value of calmness and determination. All his life, he followed the principles laid down by his father, who taught him to never give up and fight for the truth. However, this evening, which had started out as normal, was soon going to test Edward's mettle. Edward James felt the world suddenly change as a policeman approached him. The wind, which only a moment ago had seemed refreshing, now brought with it a sense of foreboding. In the middle of the street, where the evening silence usually reigned, there was a sudden tension, as if nature itself sensed an impending conflict. The police car stood motionless, its flashing lights silently breaking the darkness, creating an illusion of safety that didn't really bode well. The young officer, Richard Hoffman, was the epitome of a new generation of police officers, formally trained, but completely out of touch with the real needs of his community. His uniformed figure seemed unyielding, and as soon as he began to speak, it became clear that his goal was not to enforce law and order, but to exercise authority. "Your papers," Hoffman said sharply, barely glancing at Edward, as if everything had already been decided for him. This was a man who needed to be controlled and suppressed. Edward, despite his inner tension, calmly took out his ID card and handed it to the officer. His movements were slow and confident, because he knew very well that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. He had always known that as a black man, he had to be extra careful in such situations, and every step he took was carefully considered down to the smallest detail. It was an instinct developed over the years. But this time, something was wrong. The officer took the documents and, without even trying to hide his displeasure, carefully studied them. There was more in his eyes than just professional wariness. It was a suspicion that couldn't be explained by logic. Hoffman seemed to be waiting for something to happen. In moments like this, Edward could feel centuries of prejudice and inequality being woven into life, affecting its most mundane moments. "What are you doing in this area?" Hoffman asked. His tone was not just formal, but pointedly unfriendly, as if Edward was a stranger here, a man who didn't belong on this street. It was not a question of breaking the law, but of the right to be here, on one's own land, in one's own neighborhood, in one's own city. Edward paused, gathering his thoughts so that he could respond calmly. He knew perfectly well that emotions shouldn't get the better of him at times like this. His voice should remain even if everything inside is boiling with injustice. "I'm going home," he said, looking into the officer's eyes. Those simple words should have clarified the situation, but Hoffman only added to the tension, as if he wasn't ready to accept such a simple answer. "We have received reports of suspicious activity in the area." "And you fit the description," Hoffman said, still holding Edward's papers. The words hit me in the face. Edward felt his inner world shrink to a point. How often had he heard such phrases? "Fit the description" was like a hidden code that many black men had heard in their lives, a phrase that actually meant one thing: you're suspicious just because you're here. Edward knew this scenario. He has repeatedly defended the same people in court, people who faced bias and discrimination just because of their skin color. And now he was trapped in it himself. He felt that all his experience, all the knowledge that he had accumulated as a lawyer and human rights defender, could not help him at this moment. Here, on a deserted street, he was just a black man who fit the description. Meanwhile, passers-by began to slow down, casting wary glances at the scene. Someone had already realized that something strange was going on, someone started whispering, but no one dared to interfere. The situation unfolded like a scene from a movie, a policeman who exceeds his authority, and a man who tries not to let it cross the line. At that moment, Edward felt the atmosphere change. He saw the look in Officer Hoffman's eyes that said he was looking for an excuse. "I was looking for the slightest sign of insubordination, the slightest deviation from the norm, in order to continue the pressure." It was like playing with fire, where the slightest spark could ignite the flames of conflict. The officer continued, "Are you going to cooperate or do we have to detain you?" His tone was icy and threatening. Edward knew there was no room for error. One careless word, one sudden movement, and the situation could spiral out of control. This wasn't just a conflict between the officer and Edward. It was a moment when two realities collided: the reality of a man who spent his entire life fighting for justice and equality, and the reality of a system that wasn't always fair to people like him. Edward stood on the cold night street, feeling the tension around him grow unbearable. His heart was beating like a drum in his chest, but his face was unreadable. This wasn't the first time this situation had happened in his life, and he knew that now, more than ever, he couldn't lose control. However, all his efforts to remain calm began to crumble as Officer Hoffman stepped forward, closing the distance between them to a minimum. "Look," Hoffman said, his voice sounding like a veiled threat, "I don't want to stand here all night and you're acting like you have nothing to hide. What are you doing in the area? Why are you alone on the street at such a late hour?" The officer no longer just asked, he seemed to demand a confession, extorted a reason for aggression. Edward took another deep breath, trying not to be provoked. Anger, fatigue, and unfairness seethed inside him. "I'm going home like I said," he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady, even though it was getting harder to contain his emotions. "I didn't do anything illegal and I don't have to explain my actions." But Hoffman didn't back down. His eyes flashed as he found something in Edward's answer that he thought gave him the right to move on to the next step. He grabbed the walkie-talkie on his shoulder and, without taking his eyes off Edward, relayed the message, Patrol 47, back up to Lakeview and Ash Precinct. Possible insubordination. Support is required. The words echoed in Edward's ears. Possible insubordination. Just 3 words, but it sounded like a sentence. He knew that this was a common practice, words that officers used to justify further actions. These words could become grounds for arrest, use of force, and further humiliation. The crowd began to gather around them, and passers-by slowly and cautiously stopped at a distance, taking in the scene. People were filming on their phones, but no one interfered. Everyone knew that this situation could easily escalate into something much more serious. Edward knew that his reputation could collapse in an instant, that one wrong move would land him on the ground in handcuffs and then in jail, and all his years of fighting for his rights, all his honest work, could disappear because of one unfair incident. Hoffman, seeing that Edward wasn't reacting as much as he expected, started to get even closer. "Are you kidding me? Do you think you're special? Do you think I can't arrest you right here, on the spot? I can do it, and no one will even move to help you." At that moment, Edward felt the adrenaline rush through his body. He always knew that such moments could happen, but he never expected them to happen to him. Not here, in his own city, on a street where everyone knew him. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, and one step in the wrong direction could lead to disaster. All of his inner instincts screamed at him to stay calm, but the emotions he had suppressed for years were now bursting out. Hoffman suddenly made a sharp gesture, as if he was about to grab Edward's arm, and at that moment everything froze. Edward instinctively raised his hands to show that he wasn't going to fight back, but he felt like he was losing control of the situation by the second. People around them started whispering, phones kept being picked up, and there was a sense of impending disaster in the air. "I repeat," Hoffman said, "put your hands down and follow my instructions, or I will detain you right now." Edward felt that the situation was out of control, and any further actions he took might be the last straw. The crowd of people standing in the distance continued to watch as if in slow motion. He was not afraid for himself, but for those who might be affected by this collision. He knew that history was full of cases where small conflicts turned into tragedies, and he knew that even if he was released, the consequences for him and his family could be irreparable. "Enough," a calm but firm voice suddenly rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned at the sound, and Edward saw a figure step out of the shadows. It was a man he recognized immediately, Samuel Brown, the head of the police department, dressed in civilian clothes but with a distinct authority in his walk and gaze. The crowd froze, and Officer Hoffman, who had been feeling like the master of the situation until now, suddenly stopped, as if he had been cooled off. Brown sauntered closer to them, his face calm but determined. He surveyed the situation as if everything was under his control from the start. "Officer Hoffman, stand down. We will not escalate this incident." When Officer Hoffman stood in front of Edward, he didn't realize how much his life would change in just a few minutes. All the while, he felt like the master of the situation, young, ambitious cop with power that he felt he could use as he pleased. He was used to the fact that his actions were rarely questioned, especially when it came to people like Edward. But that all changed when the head of the police department, Samuel Brown, stepped in. Samuel Brown is a man who himself has come a long way in the law enforcement system to achieve his position. He was wise and insightful, knew not only the laws, but also moral boundaries. His presence always inspired respect, and his word was rarely questioned. But today, his intervention was especially important, not just for Edward, but for the entire public gathered around him. When Brown addressed Hoffman, his voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that left no doubt who was now in control of the situation. "Officer Hoffman," he began, looking the young cop squarely in the eye, "you have overstepped your authority. Your actions do not meet the standards that we set in our department. You need to leave this place immediately and return to the police station. We'll discuss your behavior later." Officer Hoffman was stunned. He hadn't expected this development. Everything that had happened in the last few minutes had come as a complete surprise to him. He was used to the fact that his actions were never criticized, especially on the street, where he felt in charge. Now, under the watchful gaze of his superior, he felt for the first time that his authority was being questioned. The crowd that had been watching all this time froze in anticipation. The people gathered around them watched every move without taking their eyes off it. Some were whispering quietly among themselves, expressing relief that the situation seemed to be beginning to resolve. They had seen Brown take control of the situation, which gave them confidence that it would end without further incident. Officer Hoffman, apparently realizing that he had no other choice, nodded slowly, pursed his lips, and turned back to his patrol car without a word. He opened the door and got behind the wheel, his hands shaking slightly as he realized what had happened. All he felt was resentment and frustration, but he knew that further resistance would be futile. It was clear to him that his actions would fall under a thorough investigation, and this would hit his career hard. He was used to being able to act with impunity, but today everything has changed. As Officer Hoffman's patrol car pulled away and slowly drove away from the street, the tension that had been in the air a moment ago began to ease. The situation, which could have gotten out of control and led to serious consequences, was stopped thanks to the timely intervention of Brown. Samuel Brown moved closer to Edward. There was respect in his eyes, and he knew that Edward had performed well in this difficult situation. "Edward," he began, his voice softening, "please accept my apologies for this incident. This shouldn't have happened. We'll deal with it, I promise you." Edward, who had been carrying himself with incredible dignity and fortitude all this time, finally felt the tension leave his body. He took a deep breath, as if for the first time he was letting himself relax. "Thank you, Samuel," he said softly, meeting the chief constable's gaze. These simple words expressed not only gratitude, but also deep respect for the person who intervened at the crucial moment. Edward knew that this incident could have ended very differently. He had seen many similar cases throughout his career, when injustice caused serious consequences for those who could not stand up for themselves. Today, he found himself in the same situation that he had protected others from for many years. But thankfully, Samuel was there, a man who not only knew Edward personally, but was also willing to protect him at the right moment. The crowd that slowly began to disperse also felt relieved. Some passers-by stopped by Edward's side and shook his hand, expressing support and admiration for his self-control. People understood that he could easily have lost control, but he chose a different path, the path of calm and wisdom. This made an impression on many people, and they quietly whispered among themselves about how well he handled the situation. When everyone started to leave, Edward stayed standing next to Brown. For a while, they were just silent, giving themselves a chance to process what had happened. Brown was the first to break the silence. "I'm proud of the way you held up, Edward. I hope this incident doesn't dampen your trust in us. You've always been strong, and today you showed it again." Edward smiled. "Samuel, I know these situations happen. You did what you had to do. I know that there are people in our community who strive for justice, like you. And it helps me keep my faith." They shook hands, and Brown added, "We'll deal with Hoffman. I promise that his actions will not be ignored." Edward nodded and looked in the direction of Hoffman's car. He knew that this was more than just one incident. This incident was part of a larger issue of justice and power that concerned every person in his community. But today's victory was important. She showed that even in moments when it seems that abuse of power can win, there are those who are willing to take the side of the truth. "I'm grateful, Samuel," Edward said, his voice soft but full of determination. "Today we have made a step towards changing something in this city. And I will continue to fight for it." Samuel smiled. You've always struggled, Edward. And you know that you have allies in this fight. They shook hands again, and Edward finally felt like he could go home. It was a long day, but it ended fairly. The night air felt lighter from the moment Edward went home and Samuel Brown left for the station. Edward was walking down the same street where one of the most intense moments of his life had just taken place, but now everything looked different. The moonlight illuminated his path, and passers-by who had seen the incident now looked at him with respect. Some nodded in his direction, some whispered softly among themselves, but everyone understood one thing: this man was more than just a passerby on the street. He was an example of endurance, perseverance, and courage. Edward took a deep breath, trying to finally let go of the tension that had been plaguing him for the past few hours. The memory of what had happened was still fresh in his mind. He had to control himself when everything inside him screamed about injustice. But now that it was over, he was grateful that Samuel Brown had been there to step in at the right moment. It wasn't just the intervention of a police chief, it was a sign that justice can prevail even when the situation seems hopeless. When Edward got to his house, he opened the door and went inside, where he was greeted with light and warmth. His wife Lisa was waiting for him with a tense expression on her face. She had already heard from the neighbors about what had happened. Immediately after he closed the door behind him, she rushed over and hugged him without saying a word. In her arms was everything: fear for his safety, and gratitude that he was back in one piece. "I heard what happened," Lisa finally said, looking at her husband with concern in her eyes. "Are you okay?" Edward nodded softly, putting a hand on her shoulder. "It's over. It's all good." Samuel stepped in just in time. She took a deep breath, as if trying to ease the tension that had built up over the past few hours of waiting. "I was so scared. I thought that. I do not know what would have happened if he hadn't shown up." "We did it," Edward said, trying to calm her down. "This time, everything ended well. But I know that there can be many such situations. And every time we have to fight for justice." Lisa nodded, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. She knew that her husband was a man who always stood on guard of truth and justice, but each such situation left a mark on their lives. She could see how hard it was for him to stay calm and contain his emotions when the system he defended as a lawyer turned against him. "You know this won't be the last time, Edward," she said softly. "But I'm proud of you. Proud of the way you're handling it." Edward smiled. Those words were important to him. The support of his wife gave him the strength to continue his struggle, not to give up, even when it seemed that the whole world was against him. They sat down on the sofa, and Lisa took his hand and said, "What now? What will happen to this officer?" Edward knew that this question bothered her, as did everyone else who had witnessed the incident. He could have just waved it off, said it was none of his business, but he knew that the truth always required an answer. "Samuel said they'd deal with Hoffman," he said. "I believe that he will do everything right. But that's more than one officer. This is a problem that we face not only here, but everywhere. And we have to keep fighting it." Lisa nodded. She knew that Edward wasn't the kind of person who would let things go without consequences. Each of his days was dedicated to fighting for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. He was a lawyer who defended people from injustice, and this case was not just a job for him, it was his life. Edward, looking at Lisa, suddenly realized how much he was doing not only for the sake of his community, but also for the sake of his family. He knew that every victory he won in court, every time he defended people's rights, were small steps to ensure that his daughter Sarah grew up in a world where she would not have to fear for her life or her freedom because of the color of her skin. This was his biggest motivator. "I have to move on," Edward said, and Lisa realized that he wasn't just referring to tomorrow. "We have to keep fighting. I can't just leave it like this." Lisa smiled, knowing that her husband would never stop in his tracks. He was a man of action, and each of his actions was dictated by the desire to change this world for the better. At this time, Sarah, their daughter, came quietly into the room, apparently awakened by the noise. She went up to her father and asked, "Dad, are you okay? I heard something happened to you." Edward looked at his daughter with a smile, and his heart warmed. "Yes, honey. It's all good. I was just a little late." Sarah hugged him, and there was more to the simple gesture than words could convey. She knew that her father was strong and fair, and she was just as proud of him as Lisa was. That moment reminded Edward of what he was fighting for: the future of his children, a world where they could live freely and without fear. When Edward got to his feet, he looked at Lisa and Sarah, and there was a calmness in his heart. It was a difficult day, but it also served as a reminder that every time the truth wins, it's another step towards creating a better world. His fight wasn't over, but now that he was back home, he knew that he would always be supported by his family. "I'll never stop," he told himself softly. "As long as there is injustice, I will fight." And with that in mind, Edward went upstairs, preparing for a new day, for a new fight, with the belief that every battle for justice brings him closer to the future he wants to create for his daughter.